majority of people in that place are mentally ill. They are psychotic. They haven't had their medication and they're taking spice instead.
Can I just ask you about the sexual aspect?
The sexual aspect. There's all this kind of sexual tension in the air because everyone's kind of cut off.
And your doors being unlocked in the morning by female officers. Is that spoken about?
So...
Well, we're joined now by Chris Atkins.
A BAFTA-nominated filmmaker
was at the height of his career, but then everything changed.
He spent nearly a year in Wandsworth.
After being found guilty.
Were you conscious at the time that you were acting in a criminal way?
I remember feeling that this was wrong, it was naughty. If anyone comes and digs this over, we'll say...
Then you arrive at Wandsworth Prison.
It's a terrifying building. You've been to it, haven't you?
Yes.
The old school officers, a lot of them were ex-soldiers. Actually, the better screws to have on the wing. Been there 20, 30 years, getting pensioned off and replaced by 19-year-olds. Absolutely terrified. And they would come and ask me how to run the wing. The trial was worse than prison.
You are listening to the Jeremy Dein podcast with me, Jeremy Dein, KC. Today's issue is one very close to my heart. My entire career has been founded on defending those who have allegedly committed, and indeed sometimes committed, the most serious of offences. And that commonly involves protecting people from being sent to prison. Our prison system is crumbling and overcrowded. We have the highest prison population in Europe. And on one view, prison in the UK is nothing more than a human dustbin. A draconian but arguably accurate assessment. Prisoners are often kept in cells for up to 23 hours a day, in squalor, and the images of Victorian dungeons are really not so far from the truth. We have been warned repeatedly that our system is at a critical point about overcrowding and other significant, endemic, fundamental prison-related issues. And today we ask the question, are our prisons beyond repair? My guest on this topic is unique. Chris Atkins is a journalist and filmmaker who went to prison for more than 2 years. He has since written 2 compelling and far-reaching books about his time in prison and related issues, both of which I've read and highly recommend. So Chris, it's a great pleasure to have you with me today. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks for having me on.
Can I just ask you a bit about your background? Because you are a journalist, documentary maker, and best-selling author, aren't you?
Yep.
And you were educated at Bromsgrove School from 1989 to 1994.
Is
that right?
Yeah.
And then you subsequently made a number of films and documentaries, one of which is Taking Liberties, which criticised the Blair government for undermining civil liberties.
That was 2007, yeah.
And Starsuckers, tell us about Starsuckers.
Starsuckers. It's probably one of the most litigated films in history. It has the dubious honour of being screened in court, not once but twice. Once during the Leveson inquiry and once during my own trial. So it was kind of like an entertaining critique, expose of the media industry and the sort of deceit and lies that the media like to play. This was back in 2009. So a lot of it was about phone hacking. It was about the sort of skullduggery of the tabloid press. And we exposed people like Max Clifford, who subsequently went to prison.
Yeah. Were you in fact in the same jail as him at one point?
Same court, actually. So when I got convicted, he was actually in Southwark Crown Court, being retried for further sexual offences. So weirdly, our paths did cross again years and years later. And
I think also you wrote and directed UKIP, the first 100 Days, which was a drama...
Sort of. Drama doc. I'm not sure, quite sure what it was. It was a sort of drama documentary imagining what would happen in the 2015 election if UKIP won.
Yeah.
And we were actually, I'm quite proud of this, we were the first to popularise the term Brexit. And we basically said what would happen if Brexit occurred in the UK. And it was basically an absolute shit show of the highest order. And then Brexit did happen and it was a complete shit show of the highest order. So that was, and at the time we were pilloried. We were really, really heavily criticised for daring to suggest that Brexit might not go as well as people wanted it to.
Well, speaking to you over the last 2 or 3 minutes is already, an extraordinarily fascinating experience, because the question that goes through my mind
Why did he go to prison?
How come you're here principally to talk about your experience in prison?
Indeed.
Because you're obviously an incredibly talented, esteemed documentary maker.
Yes, yeah, but I had my flaws, and I think one of them was a sort of egotistical obsession to get the film made at no matter what cost. So just rewind back a bit. In the 2000s, which is when I started making movies, I started making movies at quite a kind of young age. There was a culture that existed that allowed lots and lots of rich people to avoid paying their tax, and they would do that by funding it through film investment schemes. And this was initially set up to sort of stimulate the British film industry. And what it actually mostly stimulated was a lot of fraud, let's be honest. And it basically meant that footballers and bankers and, dare I say, some leading barristers were putting their money into various schemes. Some of that money would trickle down to the movie makers, and lots of middlemen would get rich. It led to widespread abuse across the system, and I got caught up in a particular scheme, funny enough for my film Starsuckers, which was all about media corruption, go figure. And the scheme, that particular scheme, was so egregious that HMRC decided to prosecute everyone involved for tax fraud. So there was about, I think, over a dozen of us went on the stand for it over a whole bunch of different trials. Went on for years. I'm sure you've seen big tax cases. They go on for years and years and years and years. So it wasn't until 2016 when I was put on trial in Southwark Crown Court, venue I'm sure you know very well, and I got convicted. Actually, one of your colleagues was my very fine barrister, Simon Pentold, great guy. But yeah, I was convicted of tax fraud and got sentenced to 5 years.
It's interesting that you refer to Simon as a great guy, notwithstanding that he secured you a 5-year sentence.
Well, I like to think I secured me a 5-year sentence because I was guilty. So, you know, as you yourself know, there's only so much barristers can do.
Of course, and barristers who fight their cases very hard can properly be described as great people. But just forgive me for asking you this,
please,
but you've described the thing that you became involved in.
Yes.
Were you conscious at the time you were involved in it that you were
up to no
acting
good
in a criminal way?
It's an odd phrase, in acting in a criminal way. That's a very kind of legal way of putting it. And at the time, because I had no connection with the criminal justice world at all, I was a filmmaker who just happened to know some accountants who were having some very exciting ways to provide some money. So we definitely knew, or I remember feeling that this was wrong, it was naughty. Like
dishonest.
It was dishonest. I shouldn't be doing it, But
sorry, forgive me, at the time, did you realise that what you were doing was dishonest?
I think the best way of describing it was that it was wrong. Certainly there were things put on bits of paper that I knew to not be true. And the feeling I had was that if this ever comes on top, if anyone comes and digs this over, we'll say, oh, look, I'm really sorry, and give the money back. I think that was the feeling, that it would be in... Because until that time, it was generally these things were taken to task as an avoidance case in the civil realm. And that's what I thought would
were there
happen
professional
here.
people that were guiding you,
yes,
but still encouraging you to involve yourself in this type of thing?
Yes, and they got more time than I did.
So essentially what you're saying is that you appreciated that it was or might be wrong. But my next question is this. Did you ever envisage, whilst this was going on, that you would find yourself in prison?
No.
That never crossed your mind?
No.
So
and it should have, you know, and it's to my, you know, great embarrassment and shame that I didn't think all this through at the time. But if you want the honest truth, is I knew it was wrong, but I didn't think I'd go to prison.
Yeah, no, I fully accept that, because
I thought it'd be a slap on the wrist, a suspended sentence, or something of that in that sort of space. I didn't do the research to see what the penalties were, and crucially, as you yourself know, when it comes to a conspiracy case, you can say, well, I'm only responsible for this little bit of money over here, but actually you're tied into 10 other people who are responsible for 10 times more, and you all get done on the big number, which is what
I fully accept what you say. I've represented many people who clearly didn't appreciate at the time, as things were unfolding, what the reality and the consequences were going to be. So when... And
I could have pled guilty, and I would probably have walked. I would probably got...
But you had a trial.
I had a full trial.
You had a trial, but... When... So in terms of the activities that led you to be prosecuted,
yes,
what was the time span for the actual conspiracy was from when to when?
Oh God!
I mean, my question is really, how long after the conspiracy ended?
Miles and miles and miles, and that is a particular sort of feature of the way I think financial crimes happen and then are prosecuted. And I'm not blaming anyone else but myself for this, but I think they said that the conspiracies, I think it was 7 to 10 or something like that. I think that was the period when the money movement was going on.
Yeah.
And then I was arrested in 2012. I was charged in 2014, and I went on trial in 2016.
Yeah.
So it was, in some cases, I remember I was on trial and I was being presented with emails from 2007.
Yeah.
And I was sort of saying, this was 9 years ago, and I don't really have a great memory for it. So yes, it was significantly after the events that we went on trial for it.
So when you were arrested, was that the first point in time you appreciated that your world was about to change?
Oh God, yeah. That was a sobering moment, shall we say? Yeah, that comes out the blue. They don't warn you, obviously.
Can you just describe? Obviously, here are you. You're a very successful, experienced filmmaker. Suddenly, you're being arrested. Can you describe your emotions at that time?
I mean, it was kind of mad because I was in the middle of running a quite complex and secret undercover investigation into a bunch of corrupt private detectives who themselves were linked to corrupt police. And I was doing that for Channel 4's dispatches. So I was sort of undercover investigating these people. And at the same time, my door basically gets knocked open.
And you were being investigated.
And I'm investigated.
By being investigated.
At
the same time.
At the same time. And
Yeah.
they kind of came and took all my computers and stuff. So for a while I thought it was linked to that, but it wasn't. It was complete coincidence. But it was rather odd. My partner was 3-4 months pregnant as well. So there was a sort of lot going on. So no, it was so stressful. I remember having serious panic attacks. I had panic attacks about a month or so afterwards. And you kind of want it to be resolved quickly.
Yeah.
You want it all to happen. And then you realise, my solicitor kept telling me, like, this is going to take years.
Yeah.
You know, you can't just say, right, let's just come to some deal and let's go to trial now and let's deal with this. It's like, no, this is going to take years and years and years.
And soon after you were arrested, and then obviously you've told us that things were staggered in terms of arrest and charge and so on.
Yeah.
But in the scheme of events, when did it first occur to you that you might actually end up going to prison?
It wasn't until much, much, much later, because I kept thinking to myself, because without getting into the technicalities of it, because sometimes it's quite a dull crime, but the bottom line is the amounts that came to our companies to fund the film was in the order, I think, about 80, 90, 100,000 pounds. It was of that order, none of which was paid to me or my producer who was charged alongside me. So I thought that simple fact would not exonerate us, but would mean we wouldn't get in too much trouble, because we would say, look, there weren't any fast cars, we didn't put any of this money in our bank account, it all got spent on the film, and actually it was only about 100,000 or something like that trickled down to us. So that's what I kind of clung on to.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until really shortly before my own trial when my barrister said, no, you are on the hook for a conspiracy, and the total conspiracy is for much, much, much more money. And so therefore you will be sentenced based on this big, big figure rather than on the little figure that you've got in your head.
Yeah.
And I just didn't understand the way
Could
it
you
all works.
just so that it's absolutely clear, just in a sentence or two if possible,
Yeah.
the dishonesty that led to you being convicted,
Yes.
that you were found to have taken in, was what? What was the crime that you
The
committed?
crime was, this is all publicly available if people want to go and look up the court reports. It was conspiracy to cheat the public revenue. And I think the amount that they accused us of attempting to defraud the revenue was I think about £900,000.
Right.
I think, and that was a group of about 10 people, and that 900,000, most of which went somewhere else.
Yeah.
If that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah.
So that was the crime of which I was convicted
Yeah.
of and given 5 years for.
And just in the build-up to your trial, how did you cope with dealing with the people that were around you in your normal life? Did you tell them what was going on? Did you hide it?
Everyone knew, because of my situation, because of my media profile, when I was charged and then when it was obvious I was going to go on trial, it was all reported in the press.
Right.
So it was in the Times, it was in the Daily Mail, so everyone kind of knew.
And how do you cope with the stigma of that situation?
Well, at the time, I wasn't really focused on the stigma. I was focused on getting off, if that makes sense. So, and people around me were all saying, well, of course you're going to get off. Of course it's all going to be fine. It's all going to be fine. Because they sort of knew me sort of through my films. They didn't know that there was this sort of dirty bit of my past that I'd got myself involved with. So people around me were hugely supportive. Everyone wanted to help. And actually that continued after I was convicted. I was very surprised. After I was convicted, even more people came forward and wanted to help and sort of do what they can. Not that there was a lot they could do. So I found the uncertainty the worst part. And I say this throughout the whole process. I actually found things started to get a bit better for my outlook once I was convicted. And I know this sounds mad, but because I had 4.5 years of waiting for this thing to go to trial, I blame myself entirely. I could have pled guilty at any stage and ended it. So the uncertainty after 4.5 years is terrible. And you must see this with your clients.
Yeah, of course, absolutely.
When you go back, especially with all the court delays at the moment, you say, sorry, it's another year. And they're like, oh, God, you know.
Oh, I'm very common with people saying, even if they're convicted, I'm so happy it's over. I know what I said. But can I just ask you,
so that was the defining feature for me, was the uncertainty and the fact that it was just going on so long.
Yeah. Can I just ask you this, though, Chris, because you've told us that you've been very frank, and I know that you're very keen and willing to sort of discuss any aspect, but you did say that you appreciated that what was going on was wrong. I mean, in terms of your choice between pleading guilty and contesting the trial...
God, I wish I'd pled guilty. I mean, you look back now, don't you?
I understand that you now wish you'd pleaded guilty, but did you, in contesting the trial...
Yes.
Did you honestly believe you had a valid defence, or were you simply trying to escape liability?
I think it was a bit of both. The prosecution case was not open and shut, and I don't really want to go back and relitigate this in a sense. I don't want to sound like somebody who's trying to think he could have got off or he should have got off. You know, I did something wrong and I was punished for it, and I think that was the right decision that the court made. In terms of, look, and I don't want to blame my advisors, but there was a feeling, I had a great barrister, I had a great solicitor, and the feeling generally was that the prosecution's case was not bulletproof and we should go for not guilty. Yeah. That was the general feeling. And as you know, your client, you're not supposed to sit with your client and go, come on, did you really do it?
Yeah.
You know, that's the last thing you could. And if they say they did it, you can't represent them. So the general tenor was the prosecution's case was not that formidable, and we had a really good chance.
No, that's absolutely fine, and I'm familiar with that. Yeah. Chris, before we come on to the main topic, which is prison, I'd like you just to give your perspective on this. So you went to trial at Southwark Crown Court. How long did your trial last?
4 weeks.
4 weeks. And it was a jury trial.
Yes.
Again, factoring in that you're highly intelligent and experienced in all aspects of life. What is it like handing your fate over to 12 complete total strangers? Worse
than prison. We're going to come on to prison in a minute, and I'll talk about how horrendous my prison experience was. I always say the trial was worse than prison. You know, in prison, you're just lying on your bunk watching telly, hoping to get a shower. You know, this day, like every day, is sort of emotional torture in a sense. I have only myself to blame for this, so I really don't want to play the victim.
You've made that crystal
clear. By the
way,
and I could have avoided it by A, not doing it, and B, pleading guilty. But
I think you've made those factors clear.
Just for the tape. Yeah. But I found it, and I talk about this in a lot in my new book, Time After Time, because what I ended up doing for my new book was going back to court and watching lots of trials. Yeah. And everyone thought I was mad because I'd had my own trauma in court, and here I am going back. It's like someone who's in a major car crash going back and looking at road accidents or something. Yeah. I found it quite cathartic to sort of do it. And it's quite nice not being the one in the dock. But anyway, it's that feeling. I'll tell you what really struck me about it, and maybe some of your clients say the same thing, was that feeling that when people look at you, strangers look at you in a very different way in the dock than when you're not in the dock. To the extent where people are embarrassed. If you catch someone's eye on the tube, they look away. Yeah. Like you don't look at strangers. It's rude to look at strangers. Not in the dock. When I was in the dock, all the jury filed in for the jury selection, which meant there was about 30 of them. Yeah. So they all came right up close to the glass, and they all stood and looked at me in the glass like I was an animal in the zoo, and that was really disconcerting. I wasn't used to
You
that.
were behind a glass screen.
I was behind a glass screen.
So that in itself must have been a bizarre experience.
You look guilty. You're in a suit, you're in court, you're behind a glass screen, you just look a bit guilty. So they're all thinking, oh, what's he done? And it's the way they'd look at you, and they wouldn't turn away embarrassed. And that was the start that, like, you are going to be treated very, very differently now. Oh, it's complete lack of control. A, I'm a control freak. B, human beings like to be in control. You have zero control in the dock. You're placing your life... placing the life in my barrister's hands as well as the jury and the judge who...
But the thing about placing your life in your barrister's hands is that at least you know that your barrister purportedly has legal experience.
And he's on your side.
With these 12 people, you know nothing about them.
And they know nothing about you except the horrible things that they're reading out in court. Look, the judge... You're aware of Judge Beddoe. I'm sure he's...
Yes, very well aware, yeah.
Okay, very fair.
I mean, you drew the short straw there.
I did drew the... my barrister's face when he said, "You've got Beddoe," and I said, "What do you mean?" He goes, "He's a hanging judge." I went, "Oh, great, that's just my luck." I think he was a fair judge, but he's not your friend.
No.
And what's the best way to describe him without being libelous? You know, he's just a stickler for the rules, and doesn't give you an inch, shall we say?
Yeah. Can I just make it clear? I'm not suggesting Judge Beddoe was an unfair judge, but you've summarised it very well. He was just very pedantic and stuck with the rules, and probably didn't make you feel over comfortable in court either.
No, and I generally got the feeling that if it was on the knife edge and it could go the prosecution or the defence, it would probably go the prosecution because he was a prosecuting judge. Now, that said, I was guilty, so I don't sort of ever want to play the victim card, but I just found it an excruciating experience. And even when I was convicted and I was sentenced, I found it a huge relief that bit.
And can I just finally, before we do get to prison, would you describe the trial process in this country as fair? That's
a really interesting question. Ultimately, yes. I wouldn't think there would be a lot that I would change about the mechanics and the way that justice unfolded. I think there's a lot about the justice system that is unfair, but that's to do with the amount of time that people have. Yeah. You know, and the way that so much has been defunded and sort of all those other things, and of course the prison system, which we'll come to in a minute. But I fundamentally think having an independent jury and having a judge separated and having the prosecution and defence, and the fact that it was all very open. Yeah. It all happened in front of me. So even the jury selection, so I couldn't ever think there was any sort of, you know, unfairness or shenanigans about our system. So I did think the process was
Did you find it difficult times to accept that this was you sitting behind that glass screen? Was it a surreal experience?
It was massively surreal, because I'm used to being the investigator in my filmmaking. I'm used to being the one who's pointing the finger, and so I'm more like the prosecutor or the judge or the jury essentially in my work as sort of, you know, doing TV current affairs and journalism. So to sort of have it all, you know, on you, and I guess you don't really think you have much of a voice. You've got that little window where you're on the stand, which is also horrible for all sorts of reasons. But, you know, these people saying things about you, some of them are true, some of them are not true. And you're like, oh, you know, you want to start saying, no, that's wrong, or that's not quite right. And of course, you can't, you're silenced. So that whole process I found very, very odd.
So obviously that's an intriguing window into your experience of trial. We know you in fact received a sentence of 5 years imprisonment, is that right?
Yeah.
Of which you were actually physically in prison for just over 2 years?
It's 2.5, it's 50%.
50%.
So they slice it down the middle.
Did you, before you got sent to prison, did you have a vision of your own as to what prison would be like? I mean, what I mean by that is, as an ordinary member of the public, rather than when you were wrapped up, did you have a vision? Did you have a view on prison? And what were your thoughts before your own personal experience began?
Porridge. Basically, the
Ronnie
TV
Barker,
show.
Ronnie Barker.
Stuff like that. I mean, I think it had all come from popular culture. And I think that's a big problem that we have with the system, is that it is so opaque. They don't want the public to see what it's really like because it's so horrendous. So we kind of have this massively, you know, outdated, whimsical, eccentric, wholly false view of what it's actually like inside. So no, and of course that was completely wide of the mark. So I think that was kind of what was in my head. I thought I'll go and share a cell with Fletch and Gobler, and get
have
on
a bit of fun.
Have
a bit of fun.
I didn't, and I think also I avoided Googling it because I didn't want to know.
So did you, at no stage during the process, did you Google and see what might lie ahead of you?
No, I think I was just in denial.
Right.
I didn't do my research. But my friends did. So once I got convicted, there was a week between my conviction and sentencing, which I had at home.
Right.
But so my friends were like Googling for me.
So you got convicted and the judge gave you bail pre-sentence?
Yes. Yeah.
And during that week, before you went back to be sentenced, you knew that you were going to prison for a significant period.
Yeah. Because we got done on the conspiracy count. Yeah. My barrister's like, you're going to go to prison, it's going to be for several years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that week leading up to when you actually went to prison, what was going through your mind?
That was odd. It was kind of the best and the worst of times, because so many people came forward to express support and love or just wanting to help, like friends of my family or people who I'd worked with 10 years before, I didn't even think liked me very much, were texting me, ex-girlfriends were messaging me. It was all very positive. It was like, oh my God, this is so awful, this is so unfair, I feel so bad for you, how can I help? I had quite a young son, so my son was 4. He just he was about to turn 4.
You were living with your partner?
No, so I'd split up with Lottie a couple of years before, but we were on very good terms, and we shared a son, Kit. He's 11 now, but he was about to turn 4, so he lived half the week with me and half the week with his mum, and I think that sort of dominated our sort of feelings and plans, and everything we talked about was how we're going to cope with the Kit situation, because we were very, very close. He lived with me half the week, so now he was going to have to just live with his mum.
You deal with this in very vivid terms in your book.
And so it was sort of dealing with that aspect of it was everything we were sort of thinking about, really.
I mean, just...
Along with the very mundane things, which is cancelling my Netflix account and...
Things like that.
Yeah, things like that, which you think, well, I've got to make sure my direct debits are all sorted. I gave my friend access to my bank accounts and signed a power of attorney and thought, who's going to stay in my flat? It was, it was the big stuff, the big emotional family stuff, and also the kind of mundane, pedantic stuff.
So, Chris, the book that you wrote about your time in prison is called A Bit of a Stretch. And as I've said, I read it last year. It's an absolutely fascinating book because it gives, such profound insight into life in prison. And I'll factor in certain aspects of it, as we go through the prison journey. But what I'd like just to establish with you is this. So you go back for sentencing, and the moment comes when the judge says that you've been sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. And that's the point in time when obviously your whole life becomes transformed from what it was before. So just tell us about your first... that period following sentence and arriving in prison. Could you just, in a nutshell, could you just tell us what that experience was like?
The emotional experience was, again, weirdly one of relief because, and you must see this every day, but the prosecution were gunning for a really big number. My barrister was gunning for a very low number. So I had no idea where we were going to go. And as the judge did his sentencing, and you can look, his sentencing remarks all online, is he starts talking about some very, very high numbers, which makes you think it's going to be 7 or 8 years or whatever. But in the end, he gave me a 5. So I was really pleased because I thought, I thought it was going to be 6 or 7. So I thought, get out of here before he changes his mind. And then you go off, and then you go, it's the only time you're handcuffed, weirdly, is when you're in court because of lots of attacks that have happened on court staff. So you're handcuffed. I bumped into Max Clifford, who I'd helped in prison years before in a film, which was then part of the reason I went to prison. So that was very surreal. Had a chat with my barrister. I remember kind of being quite joking and laughing. And it's sort of like when people are traumatized, they often laugh. They find it's all quite sort of, you can't really take it seriously. You're then put in a big Serco prison transport van, like the ones you see on the news. And you're in this tiny, tiny cabin inside that with no seatbelts. And I'm quite tall, so you're kind of all cramped up. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what prison they were going to take me to.
Did you ask?
Yeah, and there's no one to ask. You're in this sort of tiny box. And then I think it might be one of the other prisoners who said, we're going to Wandsworth. And I was like, great. I know Wandsworth exists. It's somewhere south of the river, but I'm a North London media type. I don't go south of the river very often. So I was like, okay, where's Wandsworth again? And then I got there, and you've been to Wandsworth.
But just before you come to that, I mean, how impactful is it to be in a situation like that where literally you've lost complete control over your destiny because this must be the first time in your life where you're actually going life where you're actually going somewhere without knowing where you were going and not actually wanting to go there.
Not wanting to go there. There was an odd feeling of relief that at least I don't have to make any decisions anymore. Like I just had a very, very stressful week. I'd just been trying to work all this stuff out. There was an odd feeling of, because you lose complete control at that moment, because you're traumatized, it's actually quite good to have someone go, right, go there, sit there, do this. And you go, okay.
Because you don't need to make decisions
You don't need to make any decisions for yourself. Weirdly, I'd also lost my appetite completely during the trial and also waiting for the sentencing. And then that flooded back. And I remember sitting in a cell under the court and they kept bringing me microwave meals and I kept eating them. And he said, you look starving. I looked emaciated. If you look at the photos of me on the news. So I suddenly got my appetite back because I knew my fate. So I ate like about 3 curries. It's really odd. And so I felt quite good that I was eating. And then, it was just like, oh my God, where am I going? What the fuck's going to happen?
And then you arrive at Wandsworth Prison and you're put through the reception process.
It's a terrifying building. You've been to it, haven't you?
Yes.
Yeah.
It is a horrible building.
The outside of it is almost designed to give you the shits.
Did you see the outside?
Yeah, well, you're looking out through the window in your little Serco van. You've got this little window, so you're kind of peering out. It's also in July. It's 1st July.
Yeah.
So it's boiling hot.
Yeah.
And then you look out at this thing, and it's not exactly welcoming, shall we say.
It's very intimidating.
And that, I think, is the point.
I mean, it's old, isn't it? It's old.
Victorian.
It's a very imposing... It looks like an old prison, doesn't it?
Something. Yeah.
So you're
and it's not very well maintained, so it's kind of falling apart at the same time. Everyone else on my van had already been booked into the prison. They were people returning from remand trials, where they're living in the prison while they're on trial. I was the only new prisoner to be booked in, which in a way was quite good because I was just there on my own. It was just the officers. There weren't any other prisoners. And they could kind of see it was my first time inside, and I was shit scared. So they were all, I would say they were pretty nice. They were all quite
But were you scared?
I was terrified. Yeah, I was terrified, but at the same time, it was also odd. I was flooded with adrenaline. And that, again, is a sort of a feature of what happens when people experience trauma, is the body looks after you. So I remember feeling through a lot of the day, I had this kind of force field around me, which was just, I say, it was the adrenaline just doing its wondrous thing to just say, look, you're going to be okay, you're going to be okay. So there was fear, but I wasn't kind of like shaking or crying or anything.
But
I was
the
very
fear,
calm.
are you able to say, was the fear as a consequence of the loss of control? Were you scared of physical violence? Can you be more specific as to what your fear was?
God, I was going to prison. I was going to Wandsworth, which I dimly remembered being, not a particularly nice prison. And I wasn't going to see my son again for a long time. I think that was the main thing for me, was that I'd said goodbye to my son that morning. I'd given him a hug and I'd gone to trial. And I thought, I don't know when I'm going to see him again.
Did you tell him that?
Well, no, he was 4. I mean, they don't understand a lot of that.
But did you tell him you wouldn't be seeing him for a while? Not that you were going to...
I told him a few days before that Daddy had a time out and he's going to go away from
right.
it. And he was like, great, can we have ice cream? They don't
of course.
process it. And I couldn't really get my head around it. So God knows how a sort of 4-year-old is going to. So I think that was, as I said, that was always the forefront of my mind. It was, how long is it going to be before I see my son again? Can he come and visit me here? Is my ex-partner going to want to bring him to visit me here? Am I going to get visitation rights? When, I'm not going to get out for 2.5 years, is he going to remember me? I think there was a lot of that kind of going on. But I was weirdly calm, and the officer who put me in, he said, you seem really calm for someone who's coming to prison for the first time.
So you found the staff that dealt with you. I'm going to ask you more about prison staff shortly, but they didn't make you feel themselves. They didn't make you feel scared or intimidated.
No, they were intimidating because they're huge, 20-stone built like shit houses,
and they're wearing uniforms.
And they're wearing uniform, and there's all these bars and locks and stuff. It is intimidating, but they didn't come up and try and intimidate me.
So after you've been through the reception process, you get taken to a cell. Is that right?
No. You go through this weird, I call it this dystopian yellow brick road. So you go around this whole pathway with these arrows through all these stations where they take away your clothes, they take away your possessions, they book you in, they check to see if you need any drug or alcohol treatment. So there's
were
all
you
these
strip
stations.
searched?
I wasn't strip searched, but I had to take my clothes off. But they were like, oh, no, tax fraud. They kept looking at my offence and going, they're overworked, they're underpaid, they're going to be not as diligent as they need to be. And they could see I was a middle-class guy, I was in for a white-collar crime, so they were like, they weren't going to search me for drugs.
So where were you actually taken in your early days?
I was taken to the induction wing, which is by far and away, I found this out later, it's the noisiest and most dangerous wing in the prison, because it's where people go when they first arrive. A lot of them are coming down from drugs or they have mental health problems. So that's why, E-wing is nicknamed Beirut, because it's so wild.
And you describe that very, very powerfully in your book. And so here you are, you arrive in Wandsworth Prison on your first night. There's all the clanging and the keys.
So much noise.
Screaming, all that kind of thing. I mean, how on earth were you able to get your head around what was going... I mean, you live in a suburban North London.
Yeah.
So this was quite different from Crouch End.
You're a long way from Kansas. I think it just got so mad, and that initial first day, you just can't really accept that it's happening. And thankfully, no one was sort of coming up and being nasty to me. There were a lot of very, very scary people there, and the whole environment was scary. But everyone just kind of ignored me. Everyone's got their own problems, their own stuff to deal with. So it's sort of not that people said, oh, weren't you scared you're going to get beaten up? It's like everyone kind of ignores you.
But were you put on that first night?
Yes.
Were you
I was taken to a cell, and you have to share.
But sorry for you, but in order to get to that cell, were you taken through a number of gates that were locked and unlocked?
Loads.
No.
Yeah.
Everything's
a gate that has to be locked.
Yeah.
And unlocked.
So
and then I was pushed onto the wing, which is enormous. I mean,
the experience of being taken through all these gates that were being locked and unlocked, that in itself must have been another layer of trauma.
Yeah,
yes?
that was okay. It was okay when I was in the reception bit where you're being processed, because it was just me and some officers, half of whom were female and were all being quite nice to me.
Yeah.
It was when you get onto the wing with 200 very, very unhinged inmates making all this noise, that's when you suddenly go, oh shit, right, we are through the looking glass. And that's when it starts to get pretty hairy.
So the picture you're painting is you get on the wing and you're surrounded by all this array of convicted criminals.
Yes.
Some of whom presumably you suspected at least were there for serious violent crimes.
I think so, but I think it was more the fact that they were mentally ill and they had drug addiction problems. It wasn't the fact that someone had been inside for breaking someone's leg, throwing them £10,000. They were few and far between. The people who were on that wing, and a lot of them in Wandsworth Prison, were in for low-level drug crime because they were mentally ill. And those are the people that you find just cycling through the whole prison system. It's not the Mr. Big. It's not Ronnie Gray.
Yeah.
It's that guy you see begging in the street who has psychosis.
So and again, you've so much in a bit of a stretch that, vividly encapsulates all of this. But in terms, we'll move on in just a moment, but in terms of your sort of early period in prison, so were you put in a cell with one or more other people?
Yes.
And could you just tell us about your first
I remember my first cell,
cohabitees?
my first my pad mate is the term to use. Yeah, he was a guy called, I call him Ted in the book because I changed a lot of people's names. He was straight out of Porridge, funnily enough. He was the one sort of linked to that cultural reference point. He was about 60 odd. He'd been in for drug smuggling. He was quite a high-level drug importer who'd got about 17 years. And he'd come to the end of that sentence. He'd then done a bunk from that sentence, and he'd just been rearrested in Spain and brought back to serve out the rest of his sentence. And he was really nice, and he could straight away see that I was terrified. I'd middle class, never been to prison before. So he was like, sit down, have a cup of tea, you're going to be okay. So I shared a cell with him, and I'm very thankful for the fact that it was him rather than some of the other people on that wing.
Did you have any choice over who you put in the cell with?
No.
So you're simply taken to that cell?
I was taken to that cell, yes. But weirdly, the person who was like an orderly, so he was a trusted prisoner who was in charge of cell allocations, he was aware of who I was because he'd seen my case on the news and he'd known some of my co-defendants who I'd never met because I hadn't met half my co-defendants because that's the way financial conspiracies work. But he did. So he said, oh, you're part of the whole, whatever conspiracy. I know some of your co-defendants. So I'm going to sort you out.
Yeah.
I didn't mention I'd never met them. He said, I'll make sure you go in a cell with someone decent. And he did. So he put me in a cell with someone who wasn't mad and a psychopath or, massive drug addict.
And so when the door actually opens and you're put in a cell, I mean, you're going to be locked into a cell with a complete, total, utter stranger. And can you just describe the cell to us?
Cell, 6 foot by 12 foot, bunk beds. I mean, because it's the induction wing, no one stays there very long. So the cells are awful. Later cells you do get a slightly more home comforts, but these ones, because it's almost like a police cell, they're very transient. You're in the induction wing for 1 or 2 weeks and then you're out. So no one spends any time making their cell nice. And also lots of people go through who are having breakdowns basically through drug addiction, so they trash their cells a lot. So everything is falling apart. There's some rickety bunk beds. There's a toilet. You have a loo in your cell as well. There was a green sheet to sort of...
Television?
There was a TV, actually. There was a very small TV and a kettle. And a lot of these cells didn't have TV and kettles, so I was really impressed that we had a TV and a kettle. And the Olympics was on.
I'm sorry?
The Olympics was on.
Yeah.
So Ted, this guy, he was just watching the Olympics, and I was like... And he made me a cup of tea, and I said, right, I'll just watch the Olympics with you. And then we sort of chatted. And that's it. It's a tiny, tiny space. It was very, very hot. So July heat wave, the windows didn't open. The windows are sort of, double glazed, thick, sort of very thick glass with a tiny crack in, so there's very little ventilation. And you just sit there for sort of 24 hours a day, basically, watching telly.
So, I mean, describing what you've described, the scenario that you've described, and again, being the person that you were and are, I mean, how on earth were you able to cope with this situation?
Well, I didn't really. I mean, but... If you can't cope, that's also okay, because you don't have to do anything. with the trial, I was there going, oh my God, what about this invoice? What about this payment? Oh my God, what about that piece of evidence that was cross-examined? Da, 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 da. You kind of absorb, you obsess by, and you've got to be on it. But, once you're in prison, all you got to do is just sit
just
in your bum.
exist.
It just exists.
Just exist.
So even if you can't cope, it doesn't matter.
Did you cope? Do you feel that you did cope?
I think I probably could have coped better than I did, but at the same time, I didn't completely lose it. And later when
were you crying?
No, I was just overwhelmed by the adrenaline and the sort of shock of it all. And also overwhelmed by the trauma and shock of the trial, which had just happened. So it wasn't just that I turned up one day and someone said, you're going to prison. I just had the worst 4 weeks of my life.
Were you angry?
No. I was angry at myself. Like, I was very clear, like the second that guilty verdict came down, I was just like, oh, well, we did all do it, didn't we? And other people on my case were very much like, no, we definitely, after the verdict. And I was like, look, the jury's handed us their note, we don't have to pretend anymore. Like, we did actually do this. And I was quite open with people, and I found that was a big relief. It was a good relief to be able to say, I did sign off some things were pretty bent, actually. And it was nice to say that out loud, because until then, you've got to maintain the line that I'm completely innocent, because you're fighting a trial. So it was nice when I sat with my cellmate. I remember him saying, well, did you do it? And I said, well, yeah. And I remember that feeling quite good. And it was nice not to be judged.
Good in the sense that you were there for good cause.
No, good that I could be honest about it. And also that I wasn't going to be judged. I remember feeling quite good about that, because he was like, 5 years is nothing. And I was surrounded by people who had far bigger sentences for far more serious crimes. So no one was thinking, you're a bastard for doing this.
Can you just, as someone who had such an incredibly creative career, and you're out, you're investigating, you're filming, you're constructing documentaries. You were totally in control of your own destiny. Suddenly, you're in this locked room.
You have no control.
Absolutely
none
complete
whatsoever.
Loss of control whatsoever. Yes. The mental somersault of experiencing that is beyond human comprehension, really.
So that was definitely a nightmare, and that kicked in as time went on. But for the first few days, it wasn't, because I was so exhausted. I was so hungry. I was just so knackered from the trial. All I was good for was lying on my bunk and eating biscuits and watching telly. And guess what? That's all I could do. So I remember for the first few days, I wasn't chomping at the bit to get out and run around and do loads of stuff. But
to be in one room for 23 hours, was it 23 hours a day?
23 hours a day.
What about the physical restraint you were experiencing?
After a few days, it got a real pain in the arse. Don't get me wrong. I just remember the first day or two, all I could do was sleep. And just lie on my bunk and eat, which is what I did. Then after a while, you're like, I want to get out, I want to do something. Well, you can't. I wanted to go and make a phone call. Well, I couldn't go out and make a phone call. I wanted to go and post a letter. I couldn't go out and do that.
So could you just tell us about that? Because obviously we're going to come on to the post-induction period. But during that first period, the induction period, firstly... well,
there wasn't really any induction. Like, there was no one there to tell you what was going to happen.
You were just thrown into the situation.
Thrown into the cell,
And what about contact with the outside world? None whatsoever?
None, no.
So you've lost complete contact with your partner, with your friends?
You might as well be on a spaceship. That's how I describe it to people. You might as well be on a spaceship and they've cut the radio.
And how long did that go on for?
That went on for some time, in the sense that it took me several weeks to even get my phone pin set up, so that meant I could use the prison phones to call my ex, who was looking after my son, my parents, my brother, my friends. That took several weeks to set up. Visits, you're only allowed 2 visits a month initially, and they're an hour each. So it was my ex who was actually coming in, because she wanted to check the place out. First of all, I was on very good terms with her. She was kind of leading my support group, God bless her. But also she wanted to check it out and see if it was right for Kit, my son, to come in. And thankfully she said, look, I think it's okay to bring him in. So I was getting 2 visits a month, and phone calls were taking about 3 weeks to set up. So initially, nothing. But weirdly, letters started happening. People were sending me letters. So that was initially the way that I was communicating.
Looking back on this experience now, leaving aside how you felt at the time, I mean, what comment do you have to make about people being lifted from the outside world and having all contact removed? I mean, do you feel that that's an acceptable feature of the prison process?
And it's not supposed to work like that. That's the other thing as well. It's not that someone actually decided that you go to prison and it takes you... Look, it took me, I think, 5 or 6 weeks to get my son approved to visit. So my son couldn't come in to see me for about 5 or 6 weeks. I had to check his criminal record out, oddly enough. and I couldn't phone anyone for several weeks. No, that's because it's massively underfunded. That's because the whole system is collapsing, and it's a massively dysfunctional establishment. Not just Wandsworth, but most prisons. But Wandsworth was particularly bad. So you're not supposed to treat people like that, and the prison system doesn't mean to. It's just because it's so underfunded, it's falling apart. That's what happened.
So just moving on to sort of more general life in prison. Obviously, it'd be amazing to go through every day of your sentence. I mean, not perhaps so.
Not really.
but just tell us. Can you just tell us a bit more about day-to-day life post-induction? What happens about food, for example? What is food like in prison?
I mean, it won't surprise you know it's pretty terrible. You're locked in your cell. The overriding feature is being locked in your cell for 23, 24 hours a day sometimes. The only time you really get out is to get your food. In the induction wing, it was awful. It got marginally better as time went on in that place. But essentially, you get one hot meal a day, and you've all got to queue up down in a sort of little hatch. And the food's all been cooked like hours and hours and hours before, and it's been kept like vaguely warm in a hot plate. So everything's very greasy, very stodgy, or just cold a lot of the time. They put a splat of it onto a plastic plate. And it's not like in the films where you sit in a big lunch hall or anything like that. You take your food back to your cell and you sit down.
It's not Shawshank Redemption.
No. You sit in your cell at this tiny desk, two of you, and you sit side by side, try not to elbow each other, eating away with a plastic knife and a plastic fork, by which time it's stone cold.
If you just tell us, so I think the breakfast, you get a pack left for you, don't you?
Get a pack over the night before.
The night before of cereal or whatever it may be.
Yeah, but it's like fun size. It's like a handful of cornflakes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not enough.
So there's no fried breakfast. And then lunch is at about 11 o'clock in the morning.
They're really weird times.
Yeah.
10:30, 11, you'd have lunch, which might be like a baguette or something, which again was made 3 weeks ago, frozen and then defrosted.
And you have to go, you're given that in your cell.
That's given in your cell.
Right.
So the cell door opens and it goes bang on the side. And if you're lucky, a piece of fruit, and if you're lucky, a Kit Kat.
Yeah. And then dinner is at about 4 p.m.
Exactly. It's weird times.
And that's the one hot meal a day,
That's the one hot meal a day. Yeah.
So, I mean...
And that could be the only time you get out your cell, is to literally walk down the stairs with officers standing there. So you can't go off and do anything else. You can't go and make a phone call or anything. And then you queue up, you get your food, and then you go back to your cell, and then the door's locked. And that's the only time you've actually been out your cell.
So, I mean, what is it like being given food that you don't want, that you can't really eat, and then you're stuck eating it with someone you don't really want to be with? I mean, again, this is yet another sort of...
It's dehumanising. That thing, it's dehumanising. You just start to feel like an animal, is the best way I can describe
And again, at the time, were you saying to yourself, okay, fine, I got involved in this tax fraud, but do I really deserve to be dehumanised in this way? I mean, were you not angry about it? Did you not feel
I think
unacceptable?
In my view, I could deal with a lot of this by saying it's my fault.
Yeah, but it may have been your fault.
It was just a handy psychological trick, because otherwise I just get so upset at the system and the world. And you're constantly, because prison's one of these weird things where it's the worst at the beginning and then gets slowly better. So you're constantly looking for ways to improve your situation. And your whole world really shrinks to that shitty environment that you're in. But I was trying to get on the phone call. I was trying to post a letter. I was trying to get a shower. I was trying to increase my visits. I was trying to get off that fucking wing, because that wing was appalling. So you're constantly looking for ways to improve your situation, and actually, incrementally, you do. So in a sense, you sort of end up focusing on that. If I was to sit and focus, which I sometimes did do, on the reasons that I was there, you just fall into a massive pit of self-pity. Did you never feel that there was...
Sorry, did you never feel there was a disconnect? You'd committed a financial offence.
I did, yeah.
You hadn't killed anybody. You hadn't maimed anybody. You hadn't committed an offence of national security. You'd sort of defrauded according to the verdict. Did you never feel at the time that there was a significant disconnect between the consequences that you were experiencing and the offence that you'd committed?
Yeah, I think there was definitely a shock when I was told that, like most white-collar offenders, first time, get bus to open prison.
Yeah.
And you must see this as well. The open prison where things are a lot easier, it's called Cat D, and you can go out and work in the community and visit your family and do all this sort of stuff. Well, I did end up. But because of my offence and my sentence was 5 years, I couldn't go to open prison right away. So I had to be in Wandsworth for 6 months. And that pissed me off. I remember thinking, I should just be at open prison. And a lot of people said, oh, you'll go to open prison.
How long were you in Wandsworth for?
So I had to be in Wandsworth for 6 months minimum, and I ended up being there for 9. So I remember at the start thinking I should be going to open prison, and then someone saying, no, you can only go to open prison when you have less than 2 years to serve, and I had 2.5 to serve. So I was like, oh shit, I'm here till Christmas. And then that being a pissing off. And then I thought, well, I can make the best of prison as long as I'm sort of doing something. And the being locked in my cell for 23 hours a day, that was a nightmare. And that was for about a month. And then that did send me mad. After about a month of being stuck in your cell all day, every day, with nothing to do, that sends you around the twist.
Yeah. I want to come on in just a minute or two to the whole question of prison reform, but just if we could just examine briefly certain other aspects of prison life. So can I just ask you about the sexual aspect? Because
the sexual aspect?
Well, in the sense that all these men in a prison, and obviously they're cut off from all manner of human activities, one of which is sex.
Yes.
Is that spoken about? Is that a feature of prison life that people openly address?
No, I think that's a bit of a trope that people who've never been to prison will think of as important, in a sense. And I think that maybe comes from the movies. It's like the whole shower cliche or whatever, or everyone walking around. So no, not really. I mean, I think it's the same if people are sort of in the army or at school or things like that. So there was... It wasn't really a feature, but people often ask me that. But there's all this kind of sexual tension in the air because everyone's kind of cut off. You've got to remember that the majority of people in that place are mentally ill drug addicts. Yeah. So that's the defining feature of them. It isn't that they haven't had a shag for 3 months. It's the fact that they are psychotic. They haven't had the medication and they're taking spice instead. That overwhelms their thought processes more than it's been a while since I had a shag.
If we could come back to that in just a moment. But just on the topic that I just asked you, one of the things that I've seen materialise in the course of my career, which I've always found very bemusing, is female prison officers in male prisons and male prison officers in female prisons.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about that? Is that not an anomaly in the system? I mean, it seems to me that if you've been sentenced to prison for a significant period and your door's being unlocked in the morning by a female, that is just a bizarre...
Loads of women officers in Wandsworth.
Is that an acknowledged anomaly, or is it just taken in the stride of...
No, and I think in a way it was quite good. I think there was a lot of guys who behaved better around women, because guys generally do. I think, if there's a group of men and it's just men together, they're probably going to get a bit leery and boorish or whatever, and be that in the real world or be it on a WhatsApp group or whatever else like that. As soon as a woman comes in, everyone sort of straightens their backs and starts minding their P's and Q's. So I found that actually probably quite beneficial. I found the female officers in a lot of ways more empathetic and actually kind of more caring and more like, I don't care what this person's done, but they need to be treated like a human being.
Right.
So I didn't. It wasn't odd at all. I mean, you would get catcalls. You would get guys saying offensive things, and the language was very coarse, and that was often borderline racist. It was quite right wing. It was very misogynistic. Yeah, that was definitely a feature of the prison experience.
Can I ask you, Chris, and this is kind of a bridge which will take us on to prison reform in a moment, but could you just tell us a bit about prison staff? Because certainly in the early years of my career, prison officers tended to be, big, hefty, largely overweight, ignorant, uneducated men. Yeah. Now, and I know you deal with this very, very effectively in a bit of a stretch. A lot of them, I think at one stage you talk about some of them, having worked in the co-op or type place 1 week.
Yeah.
So, I mean, can you just sort of paint the picture a bit more of what prison staff are like?
No. I always say I had a great deal of respect for most of the staff who worked there. I certainly didn't fall into the trap of going, oh God, I'm a prisoner, therefore all staff are scumbags and they make my life hell and I want to do what I can.
Did they see you, the mirror image of you?
No, and we'll come on to this in a second. I think at the start they do. At the start they treat everyone pretty negatively because they don't know who you are and they haven't got to sort of know anything about you. So the default is negative. But one of the things I definitely saw was that the old school officers, a lot of them were ex-soldiers because it was a good career to go into once you come out of the army. Again, big guys, built like brick shithouses. Actually, the better screws to have on the wing because they're so experienced, they didn't take any shit, and they would keep the place running, which means you're more likely to get out your cell if one of those is on duty. Unfortunately, they cost too much money. So one of the great cost-cutting reforms the government brought in was to pension a load of them off. And I saw that happen. When I was there, I would see these old-time officers who've been there 20, 30 years getting pensioned off and replaced by 19-year-olds. who had just been working at, Dixon's,
Yeah.
and the only
Yeah.
experience of authority they really had was maybe captaining a school football team.
Yeah.
And they're suddenly given a set of keys and sent on to one of the most dangerous wings in Europe. And then suddenly these kids were coming in, literally rabbit out of the headlights, and they would panic and they would lock everyone up at the first sign of trouble. So they were worse to have around. And they were very sort of terrified, they're very inexperienced, and also they wouldn't stick around very long. So the retention of those sort of newbies.
So how did
was
it feel
pretty low.
being sort of subservient to a 19-year-old, 20-year-old who, historically was working in Dixon's or the Co-op or
It's quite funny.
M&S or whatever?
The best way to get through the prison experience was to laugh at it. And I found that very early on. It's one of the things Ted told me. He said, you've just got to laugh. Start finding it all funny, and you'll just find it a lot easier.
Yeah, but isn't that easier said than done?
It is easier said than done, but fortunately there was so much mental stuff that was going on in Wandsworth for me to find it funny, and also I started writing it down, and that's why I wrote a book about it. So I found like these hipster screws. Some of them were like 5'2", and they had these beards, and it looked like they'd just come out of Shoreditch or something, and they were just like absolutely terrified, and they would come and ask me how to run the wing. They would come and ask me what time we should open people up for lunch.
But so just under the umbrella now, prison reform, you've said several times, we haven't really touched upon it in any detail, that so many people who are in prison have personality disorders, psychiatric disorders, they're psychotic. Would you say that the majority of the prison population, I know you're not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but in your view, from what you experience, are the majority of the prison population unwell?
The governor of Wandsworth said the majority of people in Wandsworth while I was there had a mental health problem. So, yes, I would say mentally unwell. Not so much physically unwell, though there was quite a bit of that. But yeah, it was a mental health problem and drug addiction, and those two things, being two sides of the same coin.
So those people, and I share, that assessment and my experience, obviously, but those people with all these sort of conglomeration of different problems, drug addiction, coke, heroin, whatever it may be, psychotic, personality disorders, suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, victims of sexual abuse, violent abuse, emotional abuse, all thrown together in one place with people like you. Yes. All in a big human dustbin.
Human dustbin. I was at the top of the human, or the bottom of the human dustbin, whichever way you want to look at it. But yeah, Wandsworth I think it had the second highest suicide rate in the country when I was there. It was like the biggest prison in Europe, and it was the second most overcrowded. I think those were the stats when I went there.
So on the question of reform, it's probably difficult to know where to start in terms of discussing how our prison system should be reformed. Would you agree with that?
Oh God, but then again, because it's in such a terrible state, it shouldn't be hard to reform, because everything about it is broken. So there's no shortage of things to provide fixes for, But I almost think it couldn't get any worse, and then it does.
Yeah, but on that theme, and I share that view from my experience, on the theme that it can't get any worse, if you were appointed Minister of Prisons tomorrow, where would you start in reforming the prison system?
For goodness sakes. There's so many things. One is don't send as many people to prison. Don't send them to prison for as long as we are. So sentence lengths have been going up and up and up. Again, so I'm sure it's something that you've seen as well. And have more facilities inside the prison to try and fix the reasons that people committed crime in the first place. And I don't put myself in that pot, as you've heard here extensively. The reasons I went to prison were quite different maybe from most of the people there. But if people are often inside because they haven't got anywhere to live, they're talking about recriminalising homelessness. People are inside because they have a drug addiction, and then they steal to fund their habit. So if you fix the drug addiction, you might start fixing the criminality that's associated with it. So it's not just a question of locking people up and putting them in these warehouses and locking them in tiny cells for 23 hours a day. It's saying, look, you've got them inside. Let's try and address the things that cause the problems in the first place.
And that's not happening in your view?
No, they're making worse. So people's drug addiction get worse while they're in prison. People's mental health problem gets worse while they're in prison. If you have an accommodation issue, that you're going to lose your digs when you go inside. You're going to come out with nowhere to live. You're going to have your family ties separated while you're inside. So there's all these are key factors in so many of the crimes that people go away for. It's very few middle class filmmakers committing tax fraud. There's very few Mr. Biggs orchestrating armed robberies. It's the human dustbin you were talking about. It's all the people who aren't caught by any other net in society end up in the prison system, basically.
And on the question of overcrowding, you mentioned overcrowding, and obviously that's another factor that needs to be looked at within the sort of prism of reform. But Did you feel that the prison was overcrowded?
Oh God, yeah.
And what does that actually mean? What does overcrowding actually mean?
Well, overcrowding actually means is you've got the number of prison officers goes down and down and down, and the number of prisoners goes up and up and up. And contrary to what a lot of your listeners might think, you wanted more prison officers in. You were desperate for more prison officers to work there because it meant you could get out your cell and do various things. So let's say basic things like exercise. There's an exercise yard. We would go for weeks without seeing the exercise yard. Why? There weren't enough officers to take us on because they were too busy being sucked into other bits of the prison. So overcrowding means this officer to prisoner ratio gets stretched to breaking point. So literally all they can do is let you out for your food and maybe a shower and a phone call, and that's it. So that was the problem with overcrowding, is it stretched the existing resources thinner and thinner and thinner.
And in terms of, again, your experience and the question of reform, you've told us about all these people you were thrown together with, and we've got the clearest possible picture. But what percentage of the prison population would you say made you feel physically threatened?
It's an odd one because I felt threatened from day one, but it took me a while to come to the understanding that you'd only be threatened if you gave people a reason to threaten you. So there's a lot of violence in prison. There's a huge amount of violence in prisons, but a lot of it is there.
Did you witness that violence?
Oh God, yeah, every day. But it was often targeted. It wasn't random. So quite a lot of it was over debts. Like there's a huge trade in tobacco. There's a huge trade in drugs. So if you were to get some tobacco or some drugs on tick, which I'm sure you know means you get the drugs now and you pay for it at the end of the week. If you didn't pay for it at the end of the week, you got thumped. And I'd say that was a large majority of the violence there. You also had an issue in a place like Wandsworth and other inner city jails in London where you have these street gangs are all being locked up, and all the rivalries and beefs and the problems from the outside
move in. Yeah.
And as you'll see, I'm sure you've been down the Old Bailey enough times to look at all the sort of street gang violence and all the murders that are associated with that. All the retribution and the sort of backdraft from that gets carried out into the prison system. So a lot of the time people are being beaten up because of something that's happened on the street outside, and that has carried on into the system. I wasn't a member of any street gang, so I wasn't going to get sucked up in that.
But what you're telling us, we're going to have to move on to sort of just 2 or 3 concluding issues in a moment. But what you didn't experience was that sometimes portrayed image that if you're in prison, people just look at you and there's a risk of you being stabbed or just for the sake of violence. That doesn't happen. If you keep yourself to yourself, largely,
yes.
Are you safe?
I felt, after a while, I felt safe, and there were various reasons for that. And one is I made myself really, really useful. It was my own way of coping with the situation.
You were a listener, weren't you?
I was a listener. So briefly to explain what that is, the listeners, it's a scheme that's run by the Samaritans to deal with the spiralling levels of suicide and self-harm that happen in British jails. So they train up trusted inmates like myself to basically be a shoulder to cry on, a sounding board, a counsellor for people who are feeling suicidal or self-harming or just having a really shit day, which is half the prison, most of the time. So any prisoner at any time could hit their emergency bell in their cell. So what's supposed to happen is an officer comes and they call for a listener, which means I would then get put in a cell with them. I get locked into a cell with some of the most damaged people in the prison, and I would be their shoulder to cry on, someone just to moan at for half an hour, which is hugely rewarding work. I'm very, very glad I did it. But it also meant I was kind of like their only friend. So I never really felt overly threatened doing that. And also people got to know me as the listener on the wing. And I'm the person who's trying to help them through this. So you don't... People's self-preservation kicks in and you don't become a target. Also, a lot of prisoners have literary issues, and the only way that you get anything done in prison is by filling in forms. It's a very antiquated system. So I would fill in forms for people. People would turn up at my door with a form and a pen because they couldn't read or write, saying, can you fill this in so I can get my trainers?
And again, for anyone who is interested, you deal with this in a lot of detail, in a bit of a stretch, and it's incredibly interesting.
So for that reason... people were kind of on my side. I made myself useful, so I was unlikely to be beaten up by people because I just helped get their kid on a visit or something like that.
As we move to a conclusion, on the whole question of reform and rehabilitation, we're not going to have time to sort of discuss your second book, Time After Time, in great detail, but this is all about repeat offenders. And, you outline how 80% of criminals who receive cautions and convictions are reoffenders, and reoffending costs the taxpayer £18 billion a year.
Yeah.
What's said, I think, in part of the introduction to the book is that British prisons have to endure the most inhumane and barbaric conditions imaginable. So why do so many of them keep going back? That's a question that's raised. Can you answer that first? Well, notwithstanding that this is a horrific institution, why do you think so many people do keep going back?
I mean, it is the big question that sort of spurred me on to write this book, and it came about because I was interviewing a lot of ex-lags or ex-offenders for my own podcast, which is called A Bit of a Stretch, and I was interviewing them about their prison experiences, and I found that over the period I did that, a lot of them were going back inside, and I was like, why on earth wasn't it like bad enough the first time? Why would you want a repeat visit? So I became obsessed with the idea of reoffending. And, I think 45% of all prisoners are reconvicted within 1 year. That goes to 60% on short sentences. So, it's to look at the things that are there in the outside world. So things like the probation service and the housing services and the drug services, all those things have been cut and are non-existent. And it's almost like what is wrong with our judgmental attitudes in the outside world, that people aren't given a second chance and they're almost funneled back into crime. And I saw lots of cases where people got out and started committing crime again. Fair enough, back inside they go. But in other cases, they got out on a long license period and they might have been late for a probation appointment, and they'd go back to jail again for several months simply by being late for an appointment. Yeah. Or some of them were told, you can be out of prison on license, but you're not allowed to be homeless. They weren't given anywhere to live. So they sleep on a park bench.
So people are just driven back by circumstances.
By circumstances and by the system. It's almost like a system is there not to lift people away from criminality, but it's to push them back towards incarceration.
So that's another real sort of fundamental anomaly about our prison process. So can I? Obviously, you've really sort of let us into the world of prison, and you've just, as I said, I would very, very strongly recommend both books. Especially, if you don't mind me saying, A Bit of a Stretch.
Thank you.
But perhaps I can just conclude by asking you this. I mean, in what way do you feel that your prison experience has changed you, if at all?
I think it's made me a better person. It's made me less judgmental. It's made me more understanding that sometimes people just have a really shit hand dealt to them in life, and they end up in a pretty bad place because of that, rather than because they are bad people who have done bad things. And it's just to look at the world with slightly more sympathetic.
It's very interesting that you say that, because those comments are very much shared by me, but from the perspective of someone who's defended, people in the process. But I think my last question is really this, based on what you've said. Is there a part of you as a journalist, an investigator, someone with a, profound curiosity of the world, is there a part of you that's actually quite pleased that you went to prison?
I mean, it's an interesting take, and it's not the first time I've been asked that, because I'd tried to write books throughout my professional life and never ever got one off the ground. And then I went to Wandsworth Prison and I got a Sunday Times bestseller out of it. So, there's a part of me that thinks, great, I got great content.
Leaving aside the financial or reputational benefits, as an individual, because you're an investigator, is there a part of you that says...
It was a great story. I was in a great story, and I was the protagonist of this story. So in a way, every journalist longs for that. But more broadly, and I think more seriously, I was away from my son for 2.5 years, had a profound impact on him, and the separation had a profound impact on me as well. And I would never, want to make light of that or sort of celebrate that. And that always sort of had to come first. So I'd rather it hadn't happened because of the impact it had on him, because he was blameless in this. But taking that out of the equation, I got some good stories out of it, and and it's given me a sense of purpose. I now run a charity that donates books to prisons, and I have a great time doing that. And it's given me great access. So time after time is writing about criminals who most journalists couldn't get near. Like, most criminals don't want to talk to journalists, because why? Because they're going to publicise what they're up to. So in terms of my access, I can pick up the phone and talk to certain characters that I would never get close to before. So it has brought some interesting benefits.
All right. Well, look, Chris, thank you so much. You've built on my assessment of all your work through my reading of the books. It's been incredibly interesting, intriguing speaking to you, and I'm really grateful for you giving up your time. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.